Emily Dickinson often is unfairly labeled as a poet almost solely preoccupied with death, a poet who is largely depressive, a poet who looks on more of the negative side of life. Well, to look at Dickinson for even a little bit shows how inaccurate this is. You quickly come across exuberant poems celebrating nature. This is the day when the birds come back. I taste a liquor never brewed by tankers scooped in pearl. Some keep the Sabbath by going to church. Just to name three poems where Dickinson expresses this sort of Emersonian love of the natural world. However, Dickinson was very much preoccupied by death, preoccupied by the death of others, preoccupied by the mourning of those deaths of others, preoccupied by her own death, preoccupied by the afterlife. So it's important when we move into Dickinson's poetry to think about the role not only of death, but of what comes along with death, which would, of course, be absence, erasure, nothingness, pain. And what we find out rather quickly for a poet like Dickinson is that these states, on the surface quite negative, were actually, how can I put it, muses. Absence, nothingness, blankness, pain. These, for Dickinson, were not signs of lack. They were signs of energy, force, fullness. These markers of what was not, what is not, strangely enough, struck Dickinson's imagination as positive forces. And we see this over and over again in her early and late verse. Now, why was Dickinson so preoccupied by death? First of all, we need to say this, that her interest in death was not so odd for her generation. She was living in Amherst, Massachusetts, deeply religious area of the Northeast, religious in a way that was much more traditional than the kind of religion we saw in Emerson. Emerson was, of course, a Unitarian, trained as a Unitarian. So his theology was much more liberal and optimistic. Amherst still had a taint of that old time Puritan religion, the idea that we are deeply depraved and that we ultimately deserve little more than to suffer and hopefully to follow the will of God, and hopefully God has predestined us to find salvation. Now, Dickinson herself certainly was not an Orthodox Christian by any stretch of the imagination. As I mentioned in another lecture, it seems quite likely that when she was, I think, 18 years old at Mount Holyoke Seminary, which was really just named for a high school or college, kind of a women's institution sort of between high school and college. Apparently all the girls, young women I should say, were asked to stand up to profess Christianity, and Dickinson herself sat down, suggesting that she did not want to conform to the traditional idea of Christianity. Well, regardless of her intensity toward the Christianity of her geography, she lived in a time when to think about death was seen as an act of piety. To think about the death of others, to sit at the deathbeds of others, to think about your own death would be a way to meditate on your soul. The idea being that the state of your soul when you die will ultimately dictate what your soul will be like throughout eternity. So to think about death was not seen as a morbid thing necessarily. In fact, it was seen as a rather positive mode of practicing piety. But putting that general sensibility aside, that mid-19th century Amherstian sensibility, there are particular moments in Dickinson's life which would make her more prone to be preoccupied with death. So first of all, when she was a very young girl, one of her closest friends and second cousins, named Sophia Holland, died, and Dickinson was deeply distraught. At a certain point, when Sophia Holland was very close to death, she was told that she could not go into the room anymore because Sophia had lost her reason. She was raving, insane because of her sickness. And Dickinson said, if I can't get back in that room one more time, I feel like I will die. So she was allowed to look through the window or stand in the doorway to see her friend. Dickinson fell into what we would probably call a nervous breakdown after this, and she had to go away from Amherst for a while to stay with a relative. It really hit her very hard. So at a very young age, someone very close to her dies, and she suffers mightily for this. But this is only the beginning. When she was a teenager, two of her two tutors at Amherst Academy, where she studied, uh, young men that she admired greatly, great teachers, great minds, both died, and this affected Emily pretty profoundly as well. And also her teacher at Mount Holyoke, one Mary Lyons, was also she also died when Dickinson was fairly young. But throughout Dickinson's life, people died, and so she was very much aware of the tenuousness of life and very much aware of the possibility that anyone could die any time, and knew very well the pain of losing those that one loves. Well, also, her house in Amherst was close to the cemetery. So she would have seen funeral processions every week of her life, several times a week, especially during the Civil War. She actually wrote her greatest poems during the Civil War, and she would have seen a lot of activity in that cemetery. And of course, she just would have been aware of the deaths of many young men. So that would be a third factor. If the general sensibility is one reason to account for interest in death, and if those dying who were close to her is another reason for thinking about Dickinson's interest in death. The third reason would be her proximity to the cemetery, and the fourth reason would be the fact that the Civil War was very present to her when she was in her early 30s, writing some of her greatest poetry. So, given the prevalence of death, absence, lack, blankness, pain, we see in her early poems, the poems of the early 1860s, an idea show up over and over again that somehow lack is fullness. And I'm just going to read off a few lines that give you a sense of that pretty quickly before going into the role of pain in the writing of her poetry. So, an early poem: success is counted sweetest to those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend the nectar requires the sorest need. In other words, only through a deep hunger can you fully appreciate the taste of nectar. If you're full, you can't really appreciate the taste of food. But if you're starving, the food tastes extremely good. So this is a way in which lack can become a positive. Water is taught by thirst, she says in another poem, as land by oceans past, birds by the snow. If you are thirsty, you will know water much more intensely and much more intimately than someone who is not thirsty. To learn the transport by the pain, as blind men learn the sun. So painfulness can lead to a transport into a kind of pleasure and joy and ecstasy that you can only know through the opposition between pain and joy. As blind men learn the sun. If you can't see at all and suddenly you can see, then the sun will really shine more brightly than if you could see all the time. So this is a basic paradox, that the more intense the pain, the more potentially intense the pleasure that results, and vice versa. For each ecstatic moment, we must in anguish pay, is another way to think about this. So even when we're in the height of ecstasy, we must pay for that by the anguish which comes afterward. So we saw that for Walt Whitman in section 2 of Song of Myself. He talks about how he likes perfumes. He likes perfumes stacked on shelves, but ultimately he wants to breathe the air. The air alone is enough for him. He is mad to be in contact with the air. Well, this is not true for Dickinson at all. Dickinson actually used the metaphor of perfume to describe what she saw as a model poem. So in this way, she's the exact opposite of Whitman. She says, for instance, essential oils are wrung. The attar from the rose is not expressed by suns alone. It is the gift of screws. And she goes on to talk about how the attar, which is the essential oil from the rose, can then be bottled, and it will long outlive the rose, and it will long outlive the woman who used the perfume. So, in other words, the poem is the gift of Scrooge. You must suffer and feel pain and strain to squeeze out the poem. And the poem is an artifice. It does not proceed organically as it might for Whitman. It is wrung out of you. But that is precisely what gives the poem its power to live beyond the moment of its writing, and indeed to live beyond the life of the poet. So for Dickinson, the muse is pain. And we see this most clearly in a poem, an early poem that begins like this: A wounded deer leaps highest, I've heard the hunter tell. 'Tis but the ecstasy of death, and then the break is still. So the deer being wounded will jump much higher and run much faster than if it were not wounded. So there's a vitality to the wound. And then she explores this idea in more depth in thinking about where poetry comes from. The smitten rock that gushes, the trampled steel that springs, a cheek is always redder just where the hectic stings. So you smite the rock, and out of the smitten rock comes water. This is, of course, an allusion to Moses in the book of Exodus, who strikes the rock with his staff, and out of the rock comes water. Of course, it was thought in the 19th century that Moses might well be the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, so an poet. But his verse comes out of violence, striking. The redness of the cheeks, suggesting vitality. They're reddest when they come from a fever. So you see how this dynamic works itself out. So as we go through Dickinson, we need to shift a bit from our sense of Whitman. Whitman is yawping and yay-saying most of the time, even though certainly has a very tragic sense of life during the Civil War poems and after. But Dickinson, really throughout, there's this feeling of nothingness being something, of lack being fullness, and of the erasure of life being strangely and profoundly vital.